everything?
Okay, everybody, it's exactly 1:30 Texas time. Welcome to the final plenary session. It's called Building Back Better, New Directions for Transportation and Health After the Global Pandemic. And my name is Joe Zietsman. I'm the director of CAR-T, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this final plenary session. We are very excited today to have a real treat in terms of the speakers. When I reached out to Larry, Alberto, and Carter to ask them if they will be willing to speak in this closing plenary, they all agreed and said yes. And that was really good news because they all bring different perspectives to this discussion in terms of where we're heading. So they have slightly different academic backgrounds. They work in clearly different organizations. And so, like I say, I think they're going to bring very different perspectives. So up to this point in the symposium, we were very focused on the here and now, what is going on with our current research projects, what are we finding, what are we thinking. But in this session, we're taking a look beyond COVID. So we're taking a futuristic look and see what do we expect is going to happen and what should we be doing differently as a result of this major pandemic that hopefully we're getting the end to. So yes, I'm really excited about this discussion. It's also going to help us a little bit with our research agenda. I think what we will be discussing today will also help us focus in terms of where research needs are and where we should be focusing on. So that's the good news. And I think the way we're going to handle our presentations today, obviously, I'm going to introduce the speakers in more detail. They give their presentations. We'll take some questions. So please go ahead and use the Q&A function on your screen, not the chat, because that's for public consumption. So go ahead and use the Q&A and put your questions out there. And I will ask them to the panelists. And at the end, I'm sure we're going to have some quality time to get into some more detailed discussion and see where that takes us and maybe tackle a couple more questions. So that's the idea. And again, thank you for joining to this final plenary session. And thanks again to our speakers. So I'll start with introducing Dr. Larry Frank. He's going to be our first speaker. And Larry Frank is a professor at UC, University of California at San Diego. He specializes in the interaction between land use, travel behavior, air quality, and health, and in the energy use and climate change impacts of urban form policies. He's a walkability pioneer and was among the very first to quantify connections between built environment, active transportation, and health. He coined the term walkability in the early 90s. And I think, Larry, if you charged $1 for every time that term got used, you probably would have been a billionaire. And I probably would have owed you several $100 myself. So I did not know that you coined that term. So Larry, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing Alberto and Carter's presentation. Definitely a nice combination of backgrounds to talk about where to from here. The term walkability actually coined itself. We're really there was nothing else to call it. We were basically, it was late 80s. In fact, we're just talking about how do we characterize places where you're able to walk. So I really take very little credit in that. It just sort of happened on its own, and it probably happened organically in a lot of different settings. So I think of this as treating two pandemics for the price of one, and there's a really good reason for that. I'm going to talk about why I gave that discussion, that title to my talk. So focusing on transportation and land use decisions and things that local governments, state, regional planning agencies, both on the transportation and planning side, but also on the public health and air quality management side, really can implement. So transportation investments, where they go and what modes we invest in, we know affect where developers choose to build. Obviously, location is the golden rule in real estate. And boy, have we ever seen a change in the location where development is happening and the pressure of growth. We'll be talking about today some changes in that. So where growth goes and the type of development we see respond to the kind of transportation infrastructure investments that we as a society make. We are now right on the cusp of a major infrastructure funding a bill that will really transform a lot of our cities. And that will be very important. That affects travel behavior, what gets built, where it gets built, which affect our health in terms of our patterns of behavior, if we're sedentary or active, and how we get around, the air pollution that we're exposed to or not, and that affects our health, both in terms of chronic and infectious disease, which affects cost. So monetizing the health impacts of these transportation investments, in addition to accounting for greenhouse gas, climate change impacts, and equity and social well-being for across the society, all members of society, are things that our new administration, federal administration, are looking for. This slide just kind of shows a characterization, and I don't really know how the 10% and 40 and these percentages were allocated, but physical environment is up there in terms of its impact. Social and economic factors, clinical care, and health behaviors, but health behaviors are really related to the physical context where we live, work, and play. So it's sort of a question. Obviously, these are features that are modifiable of the environment, transportation, land use, and community design. After COVID, what will normal be? This is St. Paul, Minnesota. Lots of examples in the media. I just clipped two things. I happen to spend a lot of time in Tucson. Slow streets. There's all kinds of things happening all over the country. I will get to another example, but one way to think about it is that what we build, our built environment, transportation, and land use decisions, is the foundation upon which our behavior rests, our patterns of travel, physical activity, social interaction, and social capital, opportunities to interact. That affects our environment, the quality of our environment, and our quality of life and our health. So measures of performance being tracked through time at each of these four levels of this pyramid are things that we're going to be seeing more of in the future. And we actually now have longitudinal data that we just completed. The second wave of the Smart Location Database for the US EPA is now coming out soon. And that'll be a tool that many of us can use. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation fund us to actually take that data, and we add to it a lot of data on natural environment through Enviro Atlas and things that that EPA produces, and other data is added to it as well on social environment from the census. So planning related impacts, we are now looking at a newfound appetite for improvements in communities, things that were formerly really not allowed or not even considered, such as converting street lanes of traffic, reappropriating road space to more walkable, greener settings, accommodating other modes of travel. There's an erosion of the 5-day work week, formerly punctuated with peak hour commuting. It will be again, but that has enabled outward growth, and the demand for housing at the fringe and more sprawl is a big concern. In 2004, I and a couple other colleagues, we released the book, Howie Frumkin and Dick Jackson, Urban Sprawl and Public Health, working with the CDC when I was in Atlanta. Boy, we are really going to be looking at a revisiting, and we already are. If you look at the real estate trends, they're terrifying, actually. Increased disparities in chronic and infectious disease rates across income and ethnicity. Also, who can work remotely? The digital divide, as it's being called, is critical. A lot of disparities, even getting worse. Transit investment and strong growth controls post-pandemic will be critical. So there are three scales at which we are able to invest in our built environment that affect health: regional, regional, and local. So the regional is transit, roadway improvements, and other ways that we get around regionally. But walkable, complete neighborhoods is sort of the local accessibility part of that. Is critical. A lot of our work has been, my colleagues and I, focused at this level. And then now with the pedestrian environment becoming more obviously important, where you can have good transit access, you can have destinations nearby, it can be mixed and dense and connected in terms of the roadway, but without the pedestrian environment there, it's pretty hard to get people really motivated to be active in their community. Interventions at this scale, I'm going to present a couple, are being evaluated. Street View, Google Street View gives us data on this. We're starting to use that data systematically at a global scale. Very exciting, very cost effective, very modifiable, and not so much money. So those things allow us to apply that research and interventions that are done at these scales through research we can evaluate and are getting benefits from as a society, development, creating green space in communities, transportation infrastructure, making land use decisions that enable mixed use to happen where currently single use only zoning has been, or Euclidean zoning has been only allowed, and health equity. So those are kind of some background. So this is kind of the big grandparent slide on gender neutral, two pandemics for the price of one. So this is kind of a framework that we published a couple years ago, but transportation, land use, pedestrian environment, and green space, these are the levers that we get to pull in terms of infrastructure investments. There are others as well, but these are important. And that affects travel and activity patterns that affect our behaviors and our exposures. CAR-T as a conference focused a lot on both, well, clearly a strong emphasis on air pollution exposure, critical. So we can think about if we're more active and biking more and being more physically active in our communities, maybe we have more social interaction as a result. We also can be exposed to more air pollution if from pass-through traffic and other sources of air pollution. That's critical. So the behaviors and exposures, obviously traffic safety and crime and noise matter as well. These factors through time and spatially impact we have biological responses in terms of our weight, inflammation, and stress that also interact with one another. So for example, increased exposure to air pollution causes systemic inflammation that can cause diabetes. And there's meta-analyses on that linkage. So there's lots of pathways through this diagram over to health. These physical and mental health diseases, we have been in a pandemic for a long time, a chronic disease pandemic that is. So if you get COVID and happen to have a chronic disease, the severity of the illness will be greater and the likelihood of mortality also far greater. So these two pandemics are completely interrelated. And we know that. And there's a huge social justice and equity component to that. It's highly spatial. And the investments that we make on the left can be spatially targeted to address that. This is not the only pandemic or infectious disease issue we're going to be dealing with. NACTO is a national association that has really done a great job at kind of pulling together a base. I just suggest people might want to look at what's been happening around the country. Huge transformation on the positive side where lots of things are becoming possible in local communities. This is an example in San Diego where I'm now located, looking at taking a street that has a lot of right-of-way. We have this all across America. They're going to take part of it and make it reallocate it to green space. Downtown San Diego, the gas lamp promenade is now up for consideration for the same thing. Once you get a few good examples like Vancouver did where I was formerly located, and I'll present on next, it starts to take off. And once city councils have the buy-in of the public and see, you know what, the traffic, there's plenty of capacity in the roadway system for vehicles to get around. We start to make it more convenient and better for other modes to work, and less vehicles are needed. This is, I'm going to show some causal evidence. This is documenting causal health impacts and climate change impacts of a greenway. $5.5 million was invested roughly by the city of Vancouver about 10 years ago, and we did a study that they funded us to do to look at the causal impacts. My slides just disappeared? Oh, there they are again. That wasn't a good feeling. I don't know. I was actually going to be okay with it. I figured I got a third away through my talk. The rest is golden here. So, anyways, the red dots are the cases, and the lighter colored ones are controls. So we did a case control where we have a control group. These people in the red were close to the greenway, so they got the treatment, and those did not. And here we've got incredible results. But this is what this looked like beforehand. It was beautiful. But it was largely dedicated for vehicle movement, and the city took this corridor through an area of a city with a lot of parallel routes in a flatter terrain, and made this and reallocated the road space to bikes and pedestrians and made driving more difficult. That is what we call a shift in the relative utility from driving to walking, and the behavior shifted as well, as you would expect. Those close to the greenway, 300 meters, we actually found a distance decay function out of this project, which is pretty cool. We got a nice dense sample of people along that corridor, and we got to survey them before and after, and we learned a lot, and we're still learning more. 21% reduction in GHG emissions for those closer to the greenway after it opened. They biked more and drove less. Those, again, closer to the greenway were twice as likely to meet recommended physical activity levels. That then results, the diagram I showed earlier with the linkages, less diabetes and heart disease than those that will eventually result in that from the causal effect it had on physical activity. And then a five-fold increase, excuse me, not 551% increase in the number of reported cycling trips. So very good results. We're looking at social capital and sense of community. Monetizing the impacts is really critical. So I'm going to talk about that next. So we can characterize the environment, model the physical activity and the public health impacts. I just showed a bit of that. Then we can either apply just the cost of illness metric and monetize the relationships that are just directly related to health healthcare cost reductions. But we can also model the indirect cost effects. People that are healthier have less absenteeism with work and they're more productive. There's all kinds of other economic benefits, such as the lift and land value. This is a cross-section of walkability. From the ex-urban outlying area to the most urban core areas that are the most walkable. And this is just the way we characterize in quintiles Vancouver, places both in terms of aerial and then street level views of what these places look like and feel. We use this to help communicate, working with decision makers, working with the cities. Right now we're working with North Vancouver, City of Vancouver, in Vancouver, the Regional Planning Agency, Metro Vancouver, and also the TransLink, the Regional Transportation Agency, as well as the province, all involved in taking the results and implementing them through their investments and practices. So we take these quintiles, and what we found in our research was those in the most walkable places were 39% less likely to develop diabetes or have diabetes than those in the most car dependent. So that's a statistically significant relationship. For example, park access, numbers of parks nearby, also associated with about the same reduction in the likelihood of diabetes. So on the monetization side, this is for Los Angeles on the left. We were hired by the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, to do, it's a major MPO in that region, Regional Planning Agency, monetize the health benefits. They have a roughly $12.9 billion transportation portfolio just focused on active travel. We monetize the health benefits, and we found an $8.41 payback for every dollar spent on active transportation as a result of healthcare expenditure reduction and increased workforce productivity mostly. We've been working on this topic for some time and have lots of tools now in place that we can apply for decision makers to use. So on the sprawl side, and I want to make sure I got to look at, I don't see a clock, so I can be told, just tell me where I'm at time-wise. So I talked about the positive benefit of interventions in neighborhoods, but the sprawl, the question, lots of press out there about, and very clear indications in the real estate market that this fracture in the work, being able to work from home means your home can be maybe a lot of places. Going back later, to work is happening, but we still think, and there's a good reason to believe that the economics behind people working at home may not be so bad for employers. There might be 1 to 2 days a week that people work from home. So sprawl on steroids, single family homes in Sonoma and Marin County on the outskirts of San Francisco. This is all over the country, up 36%. Napa, 28%. New York, there was a 44% increase in home sales in the suburbs. Lots of, very alarming statistics of this nature. So in conclusion, I'm going to just give a quick showing of how we apply the evidence that I just mentioned to places more directly. We've been developing over the last 10 years and applied in a number of locations a quantitative health impact assessment tool known as the Public Health Assessment Model, or NFAM, the National Public Health Assessment Model, that where extensive all the data is already available, and we can quantify health impacts from built and natural environment investments that are being considered. This was using the California version of that model in Los Angeles as part of the Los Angeles NPO's Regional Transportation Plan update. And in the expected direction, their aggressive plan to try to make LA, well, they're investing in a tremendous amount of transit infrastructure, as we all know. They have a huge bond initiative, about $160 billion. That plus the land use decisions that they're making will really transform a lot of their communities, like Glendale, which will show significant increases in all of the active modes, reduction in driving significantly, and a reduction in all these chronic diseases. Very interestingly, the board of this organization, a transportation agency, looked at all of these health indicators as they chose their preferred alternative of how to invest in transportation. I'm going to jump ahead quickly. This is San Diego, where I am now. This is an example of applying the tool to a transit-oriented development, a station area along the San Diego trolley down near the Mexican border. They have a plan to implement and add 3,000 more households in their community. And I'm going to just jump ahead for expedience. I want to turn over to my colleagues to hear their talk. But at Palomar Gateway, we found a 9.6% reduction in the likelihood of diabetes and about a 15.4% reduction in high blood pressure if they were able to build that plan around the trolley station that they proposed, using data from the California Health Interview Survey as a way to measure the likelihood of those changes based on that local data. So very good results on that. Disrupting the car, obviously, we are in an era now where we need to be thinking about creative solutions. They are happening. This digital divide is a critical issue. I'm just going to jump ahead. I mentioned it. I think we understand what it is. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions later and to hearing my colleagues speak next.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that very interesting presentation. I think I'm going to post a few questions in your direction, and then we'll go to the next speaker. But you know, if we that parent diagram that you referenced, the question I have for you on that is, you make the leap from the intervention to the health impact, and I was just curious to know, do you often run into problems to make that leap, or are you confident to say doing X gives me Y health benefits, etc.? So how do you feel about that, and what's your take?
Thank you for that question. Certainly an easy one. No, just kidding. No. I showed two different kinds of experiments. So I will use the data. I did not show all the data that's behind the tools. So when I got to this slide and I showed these impacts, we were taking 40,000 people from the California Health Interview Survey and spatially joining them to all the different built environment metrics that I mentioned earlier, the things that are affected by their plan. So we have a lot of evidence behind the tool that's statistically significant, and then the model gets developed and the relationships are expressed statistically, and then they're brought into this software tool. The way that the tool, we know if the tool is accurate or not, and predicting chronic is to predict health outcomes, Joe, the chronic diseases, you need a large sample to get a statistically significant, to know what the relationships are. So we use another data set, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, BRFSS, to externally validate. So we predict, and then we check and see if our prediction is what is observed through another surveillance data set, and we found it to be, we can't do it without that. So that gave us confidence that what we're predicting is what is observed at baseline current year. Going into the future, there's obviously a lot of things that will happen that we're not sure about that will affect these relationships, but what we are able to observe in the things we're able to predict we have confidence that those are reasonable estimates within 95% confidence, for example.
Excellent. I'm going to look at a couple questions from the audience, and the first one is by Misty Zamora, and she asking, did you assess that for changes in symptoms like asthma near the Greenway?
Great question. We did not collect. I don't think we don't have in the Greenway. The Greenway is 524 people, so we don't have enough participants to look at health outcomes directly. We can model behavioral changes, and then you would apply global burden of disease from that point to be able to project what the chronic disease impacts would be. We could have asked questions about asthma directly related. I'm not so sure that's in our data set for that project. That was primary data collection. However, in California, the California Health Interview Survey, again, has respiratory ailments. And in that study, we do have really good data on the air pollution effects and the respiratory impacts. And that is built into the software tool built for San Diego because we had enough data with a large enough data set to do it with.
Thanks, Larry. There's one more question that I want to put towards you at this time. So Victoria Martinez is asking, can you expand on what is meant by exposure to crime?
Yeah, crimes against person and crimes against property are the two different forms and types of crime. That comes, there's a, we have not carried that measure. That is in the National Environment Measures database for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and that data is available. And we pulled together the best crime data that we could find that was available nationally. We have not modeled from that data. We have in other studies been trying to understand better the mediating effect that crime has between the built environment and physical activity, meaning people who don't feel safe in their neighborhood aren't going to be active. There are some publications that have come out of that research, and there's a pretty good body of literature developed around that. But our measures of crime really focus more against crimes against persons. We haven't looked as much about crimes against property, but it is a really important topic. And given the increased critical focus on social justice and equity, that will need to be a very important part of research going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, for your presentation and answering those questions. I want to turn it over to our next presenter while Alberto's slides is being pulled up. So Alberto Ayala is the Air Pollution Control Officer and Executive Director of the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. Ayala came to the Air District from the California Air Resources Board, where he served most recently as Deputy Executive Officer. Prior to CARP, Ayala was a member of the engineering faculty at West Virginia University, where he still holds an adjunct professor appointment. Alberto, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. And first of all, let me say I really appreciate your invitation to join the conference. I've been following the conference over the last couple of days, and it's just been an excellent convening of really interesting information. And I'm glad that Larry went before me, because I think you're going to find my contribution as a really complementary data point to some of the concepts that he spoke about. I want to specifically cover something we call future mobility. Obviously, as an air agency, what we care most about is clean air and meeting air quality goals. And obviously, given the fact that we are in California, I have to touch on our efforts on our climate agenda. So the first thing I want to make clear is somewhat obvious, and that is we're not in attainment of the ambient air quality standards, right? And we're not unique, unfortunately, in that regard. Many areas throughout California and the country are still dealing with too much regional air pollution. And, we have some distinctions that we frankly don't like, right? I mean, we're in the top 10 in terms of the worst air pollution with respect to particle pollution and ozone pollution. And I show simply as an illustration the trend, which is what we'd like to see, but again, we're not where we need to be most health protective. And the picture here, the graphic I show is again just a reminder. This is simply just one of the latest reports coming out of the group from Harvard, where they quantify the impact of our very heavy dependence on fossil fuels. And you can see that the estimated premature death rate is in the order of magnitude of what we have seen with the COVID pandemic. So it's definitely a serious problem, and many of us are working to try to get a handle on that. So what I wanted to do is really give you a snapshot in terms of what are the things that are happening here in the capital region that are going to be very similar to some of the things that are happening in other parts of the state and the country in terms of moving forward. And this is really the snapshot before COVID. We have a multi-pronged strategy, and again, I'm glad that Larry did a great job talking about land use strategies. I won't have to spend too much time on that, but I would say one of the principal tracks of emphasis for us is dealing with the built environment and the carbon footprint that it has. And probably the most notable thing that I want to share with you all is that we've committed and identified electrification of new construction, as well as electrification of existing buildings as one of the key strategies. It come to find out the use of natural gas for home use, appliances, water heating, etc., is becoming an increasingly important source of air pollution outdoor as well as indoor. And the fact that we can couple climate targets that are pushing for 100% renewable energy presents an opportunity for us to go back and say, can we live in a home where there is nothing but electric appliances and use? So that's currently what is driving the built environment. As I mentioned, we're also working on some land use strategies that I'll touch upon briefly, but I'll rely heavily on what Larry described in terms of what is happening down in other parts of the state. My area of focus is going to be mobility, given the fact that this is a transportation conference. And I do want to emphasize this inverted pyramid where we've got a number of strategies that I will describe in a moment. Active transportation, better use of shared mobility, meaning transit and other shareables, and then obviously the role of electric vehicles. And then the third track is this community health and resilience. And I think I'm going to guess that Carter is going to be the one that is going to touch on some of the health aspects and will be complementary to the talk. But, the key issue when it comes to community health is we've identified a deficiency in the urban canopy coverage that we have in the capital region. And we've identified that strategy as one of the principal adaptation strategies for dealing with a warming climate. So we are currently actively working on how to reach our urban canopy targets. So similar to Larry, we work very closely with our transportation planning agency in our area is SACO, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. And one of the key lessons that we've learned in our coordinated approach is electric vehicles are getting a lot of attention these days. And you might have seen the president driving around on the new electric F-150 the last couple of days, and rightfully so. Electric vehicles do have a role in helping us achieve our clean air and climate targets. However, we also need to recognize that there are some problems that EVs are not going to be able to solve. Congestion, for example. Metropolitan Transit, NPOs, transportation planning organizations in California, are mandated by state law to reach certain VMT reduction targets. And one of the principal areas that we are all concerned about and focusing on is to make sure that as we come out of COVID, we don't rebound towards a very centric single occupancy vehicle use pattern the way that things used to be in the past. So I think when you think about some of the things that Larry talked about, we want better transit, we want shared mobility, we want options for mobility so that people are not forced to get back into their cars, and we all drive around by ourselves in our cars. The way I frame that at a high level is, we really all should be thinking about how do we get to better mobility, not just better transportation. And I think that's the name of the game. And here comes the inverted pyramid for the mobility track. We certainly want to promote active transportation. If you do have to get on a vehicle to go longer distances, then it better be transit, it better be shareables, it better be some sort of shared mobility solutions. And then after all those are exhausted, if you do have to get into a vehicle, then we're saying that it needs to be a zero-emission vehicle. So in the capital region, we've got a number of programs, as you can see here in the graphic. We are very much promoting electric bicycles. We've seen that to be a real potential game changer for replacing vehicle trips. We do have the beginning of what we call innovative transit solutions, microtransit on demand. So this is not fixed routes that are, for the most part running around with empty buses, but these are really on demand microtransit solutions that we're working with our regional transit agency. And then the other two programs are really very much focused on environmental justice. Our community car share program is basically 10 communities, disadvantaged communities. So these are public housing projects for the most part, where we deploy electric vehicles in a shared mobility scheme. And our Clean Cars for All program is really incentives and subsidies for purchasing a used or new electric vehicle, zero-emission vehicle, for low-income residents in the area. So when we put all these together, we think that we've got the right solution to meet the mobility needs of our residents. Now, we're also exploring some innovations that are basically test cases. We don't know if this is really going to be the solution for the long haul, but we want to try. And we benefit from the fact that we have a commitment from the state to let us try these out. One of the key concepts that we just recently broke ground on is these so-called mobility hubs. And what these are, as you can see in the graphic, is simply a concentration of mobility services in one area. And we happen to pick one of our most disadvantaged communities in the region because in addition to mobility, you can create significant community benefits like beautification. You basically take an old empty lot that doesn't do much for the community, and next thing you know, you turn it into a cutting-edge mobility technology center that really benefits the community more broadly. And what we want to try in the mobility hub, as you can see here, is fleets of zero-emission vehicles to provide mobility services to the residents primarily, so that they can see the benefit of these new technologies, which is one of the key challenges that we have is, not everybody can afford an EV, and not everybody is able to participate in this transition to the green economy. And then the last piece of the inverted pyramid is really zero-emission vehicles. And here I don't think we need to talk about it too much. I say that if we do have to rely on vehicles, they have to be zero-emission vehicles. These are truly the no compromise, meaning you're not giving up anything. In fact, you're getting a superior vehicle than a combustion vehicle. And given that we're from California and we had to deal with the Volkswagen cheating scandal, these are cheat-free, meaning as a regulator, you don't worry about any non-compliance with these vehicles. And the one thing that I want to point out is when we talk about electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles, we really mean the two different flavors. They can be electric using batteries, but they are also electric using hydrogen and fuel cells. And that is important because we think that for the larger vehicle application, like the heavy duty trucks and the locomotives, those are probably going to be more suitable for a fuel cell technology replacement as opposed to a battery. And we're currently working on some demonstration projects to collect some of that data. So to kind of wrap up, so that is basically what we were working on in broad coalition in the region before COVID, and then COVID hit. And what we have seen, as Larry pointed out already, and everybody has observed through the conference, is obviously there was a massive reduction in VMT of the like that we've never seen before. And here I simply have some data in terms of quantifying the VMT reduction that we saw a year ago as we were deep into the pandemic. And the key now is, how do we preserve some of what we know we can do as we come out of the COVID? And I love this quote that I borrowed from a recent article in terms of, if we can come out of this and retain the VMT reduction benefit and the air quality benefit, we'll be more prosperous than if we just go back to the old normal. Because let us not forget that the old normal was really not good for everybody, right? Let us come out of COVID in a way that really pays tribute and credence to all the talk and all what we're hearing about equity and environmental justice and some of the race and social issues that we're dealing with. So the last part of my talk is this. So as you can imagine, our region had a lot of interest as well in terms of actual quantification of the air quality benefit that we saw from the significant reduction of VMT in the region. And there's been a lot of research done in this space. Obviously, some of the first data that we saw was coming out of China and Europe, simply because they were hit with the pandemic first, right? In our case, we took a slightly different approach in terms of being retrospective. What we are trying to do is look at the past to see from an air quality ambient condition if that would mimic what we saw a year ago during the pandemic. And if that is the case, to try to use that as a reference point to try to determine the improvement in air quality. So we're working with STI Sonoma technology to try to quantify and, as I say here, untangle the air quality benefits from shelter in place. And long and behold, as you can imagine, we were able to do that. And the reason for doing this is because we do want to inform a future discussion about how much teleworking makes sense for us. I think we all understand that we're probably going to do a lot more teleworking than we ever did before, because honestly, we never really thought teleworking was a real strategy. At the same time, I think we all agree that we're probably not going to continue to do almost 100% teleworking, right? I mean, I think all of us, as effective as the virtual world is, I think we're all ready to get back into more in-person interactions. That frankly, for some things, the virtual world just won't cut it. So what we did is we looked at, again, periods of the past. We looked, here you can see, this is simply a graphic of the air quality index over a year, all the way back to 1995. And we're looking at tracking what happened then. How do those conditions from a meteorology standpoint compare to 2020 for us? And then try to use that as a determinant for the improvement in air quality. And statistically, we found some significance. And I circle here a simple example for the reductions that we were able to quantify with respect to improvements in PM 2.5 and ambient air. In general, this is not completed yet, but in general, we are quantifying some significant benefit, as you can see on the table, anywhere between 10 and 30%, depending on ozone or PM. So our hope, again, is that we can take this data so that we can support a conversation about if we are going to promote, as governments, a significant amount of telework, how should that policy be in place? And more importantly, what is going to be the benefit from a VMT reduction and air quality standpoint? So it's a really interesting opportunity that we all have, because again, we all want to get back to normal. But the one thing that we do hear clearly from the public is the public is ready to retain the silver lining benefits that came with the pandemic. So with that, I conclude my remarks, and I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for that excellent presentation. I think, one of the things you concluded in talking about was this potential keep what is so good about the COVID current and keep that going. Realistically, one is wondering if that's going to be the case and what your prediction is. And maybe you can start by answering that, and then we can maybe follow up later on with the other panelists as well. But I'd really like to get your take. Or is there going to be a big rebound and the euphoria of post-COVID and everybody wants to do their single occupant driving again and go all over the place? What is your take?
So that's a good question, Joe. I think, I think everybody understands, and we keep talking about this hybrid, right? I think the transition is going to be a hybrid. I think we are going to be doing a lot more virtual interaction that we did before. But again, we're probably going to get back into some in-person interaction. I think from a teleworking perspective, depending on who you talk, everybody's thinking, well, maybe we're going to telework 2-3 times a week. Somewhere in there, we're going to land at a balance that has some in-person as well as continuation on teleworking. But what is important is, as a policymaker, as an agency, as governments have the opportunity to influence where we go. And I think that's the reason that we're doing this, because the old carrots and the sticks, right? You can incentivize the behavior, but you can also require it. And it's not outside of the realm of possibility that we could actually mandate some level of teleworking if we can actually quantify, for example, the air quality benefit associated with it, right? Because now you put the action in terms of SIP currency, which is very valuable. And typically that's how policies, the teleworking policy of the past was a recognized air quality strategy. And the reason that employers were required to promote it is because, again, it has a value in the SIP currency world. So I think it's interesting. I don't know where we're going to land, but the fact that we're actually open to contemplate the opportunity, to me, I think is a good thing.
Great. And like I said, I think we'll get back to that point with the other panelists as well. Thank you for that remark. One more clarification question that I have for you is regarding fuel cells versus batteries moving forward. And you made an interesting comment just now. You said you think heavy duties might be more suited on the fuel cell side. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail, please?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is, take an 80,000-pound heavy-duty Class 8 truck, the one that you see, running on our highway system, carrying goods from one coast to the other. For that, you need to retain a significant amount of payload. And historically and traditionally, batteries are going to take up some of that payload. In contrast, you can put a couple of car fuel cells into a big heavy-duty truck, and then you've got essentially a zero-emission operation application that mimics the diesel engine. So basically what I'm saying is, for the heavier vehicle applications, the characteristics of a fuel cell system seem to be a little bit more suitable for those vehicles as opposed to a passenger car vehicle, which we know can be fine with batteries and fuel cells, for example. So the locomotive picture I showed is actually one project that we are currently in partnership with a bunch of other entities demonstrating in the port of West Sacramento. We're actually going to retrofit that locomotive, take out the diesel generator, and put in a fuel cell.
Well, thanks for that clarification. And thank you for your presentation. The last presentation is by Dr. Carter Blakey. She is the Deputy Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She is also the Director of the Community Strategies Division, and as a Division Director, she oversees the office's work in a number of areas, including the Healthy People Initiative, social determinants of health, and healthy aging activities. Carter, over to you.
Great, thank you, Joe. And I have to say, I really enjoyed the presentations from Larry and Alberto. It's been interesting. It makes me want to redo mine, but with all the new ideas that you brought up. But what I'll be speaking at kind of a very high level. The office that I'm in, within the Office of the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, develops policy that other agencies and sometimes other departments use as well. So specifically within ODPHP, the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, where I am, our mission is really to guide the nation toward better health through disease prevention and health promotion programs. For example, we lead the Healthy People program, which I'll talk about today, which is the nation's 10-year plan for improving the health of all Americans. We also partner with USDA to develop the dietary guidelines for Americans every 5 years. And we also work with CDC, NIH, the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition to develop every 10 years the physical activity guidelines for Americans. And so today I'll talk about healthy people primarily, and also touch on physical activity, because as the other speakers have noted, being physically active is one way to get around, and also cut down on air pollution and reduce some of the chronic diseases that we're experiencing today. So healthy people is, as I said, we call it the nation's health agenda, or sometimes it's called the roadmap for the nation toward better health. It provides objectives that are released every 10 years, the beginning of each decade, starting in 1979, and establishes targets. And this sets healthy people apart from a lot of indicator sets, because we do have targets that we're transparent about, and we hold ourselves accountable to across the decade. As I said, it's been around for 5 decades. Just this last August, we released the 5th iteration of Healthy People. We call that Healthy People 2030. We actually developed, it took years to develop it, probably about 3 years. It was ready to launch before the pandemic. We had a big in-person launch event scheduled at George Washington University with the secretary, all sorts of senior level people. And then the pandemic happened. And we thought, well, we'll put off the launch for a few weeks. We couldn't fathom that we would be out of work as long as we are. We finally threw in the towel and launched virtually last August. And between that March date and our August launch date, we had to pivot a little bit to make what we were doing relevant during a national public health emergency like COVID. So we did look at the objectives that we have, and we pulled out a subset of about 100 that we felt were relevant to the current pandemic, and perhaps other objectives that dealt with public health infrastructure in particular. And those objectives are actually housed on our website, healthypeople.gov, if folks are interested. But as I said, one of the features of Healthy People are those objectives with 10-year targets. This decade, we have a big change in that we cut the number of objectives down to 355. And this was something that actually took us 2 decades to achieve. When Healthy People was first launched, we had about 200 objectives. And then we slowly climbed up to 300 and something, then 500. And this last decade before now, Healthy People 2020, we had over 1,200 objectives. So people loved it in that they could find themselves. I think one of the reasons why we grew so substantially is that everyone had a place in Healthy People. They used those objectives to go to their legislators, their policymakers, to say, this is why I need more money, or this is why I need a program. But we had other stakeholders and users who said, oh gosh, this is too big. We can't get our heads around it. So we took the step of reducing objectives. As I said, it took 2 decades to do it. We tried to do this last decade, but there was so much pushback that we just didn't do it. Our advisory committee of outside experts that we establish every decade to help guide the development of Healthy People said they didn't want to see us arbitrarily select a number of objectives and leave important health issues aside. So we made it to our target, well below our target, with the 355 measurable objectives we have now. And I say measurable because each of those objectives has a nationally representative data source, and it also has a target. Within Healthy People 2030, we have other components, for example, leading health indicators, I'll talk about in a minute. And we also have what we call the overall health and well-being measures. Those are global, high-level measures of health status, generally speaking, that are sometimes used for international comparisons. And what the significant difference this decade is that for the first time ever, we were able to get a measure of well-being in Healthy People. It's something that those of us in public health realize that well-being goes beyond perhaps, our physical health. We need to be mentally healthy. We need to feel secure financially in our physical environments, et cetera. But we finally got the National Center for Health Statistics to start adding, collecting data that's being added to the National Health Interview Survey. So we're very excited about this, and we hope that we can add additional measures going forward. And connected to that well-being, the founding principles, or we call them foundational principles for Healthy People 2030, there's a whole list of them, but in every single one, we mention well-being. And we also mention equity and eliminating disparities. So, and these are the leading health indicators I just mentioned. The leading health indicators were developed several decades ago. We release a new set every decade, and they were intended to highlight really critical public health issues. So to help people, they can serve as a gateway for people who don't want to bother with hundreds of objectives. So these are ones that for this decade we felt had the greatest impact on improving health if you were to focus very narrowly. And we have 23 leading health indicators this decade, which also represents a reduction from the last decade. And we've organized them according to life stages. In the past, we've had specific categories and topics, but we decided that to emphasize the importance of health and well-being at all life stages, we should take this life stage approach. And you can see I have the arrow at one for air quality, healthy days. And that, of course, is in the category that's relevant to all life stages. An important feature of Healthy People, both this decade and the past decade, is our framework for the social determinants of health. Ever since Healthy People was first released in 1979, there's a recognition that there are influences outside of the traditional health realm that affect or influence a person's health and well-being. But it wasn't until the last decade that we actually created a framework, and we carried it over to this current decade. In fact, this was the framework that was adopted by the department, and everyone was instructed to use it at one point. So our framework has 5 areas, 5 determinant areas. That's education, access and quality, economic stability, social and community context, neighborhood and built environment, and healthcare access and quality. So these 5 domains, actually we can categorize several of, or most of our objectives in Healthy People to fall within one of these domains. So absolutely important to achieving our objectives and our overarching goals is to be able to work across sectors. So we know that, as I mentioned earlier, that you can't really see difference if the health department works alone by itself with only its colleagues. If we were only work with NIH and CDC, there would be huge gaps in what we're able to accomplish. But we now are making deliberate attempts to call other departments to the table when we establish work groups, et cetera. And it's something that I don't know why we didn't do it decades ago, but believe it or not, decades ago, if we mentioned bringing USDA or EPA to our conference room table, people would have said no. This is only for health. So, and that also recognizes that some of the root causes of poor health are related to factors that we hadn't thought of, for example, transportation, commuting distance. If you live in a county that you have a very long commute to get to your place of work, chances are your ability to move up the ladder social economically will be limited because you've got to get to that office. So it's been exciting to make all the connections that the other speakers have been talking about. So as I said, Healthy People has now kind of changed its focus a bit and emphasis because of the pandemic. And as I think it was Larry, he talked about the chronic disease pandemic. We call that the syndemic that we're facing, because we've always had these issues of chronic disease. We've always had programs like Healthy People that provide metrics. We have lots of population data, so we look at differences, disparities across population groups, and we strive to address those disparities. And we think we've been doing a fairly good job, but the pandemic really exacerbated those disparities. And if only we could have had the population make better progress in achieving, for example, the Healthy People objectives, we would not be in the shape that we were with the pandemic. So we realized that staying healthy, and I imagine a lot of the public now realizes the importance of staying healthy in order to build strong and resilient communities. And one thing we've been doing since the pandemic is, we've always had our SDOH framework, social determinants of health framework, but what are different ways that we can address all the different determinants that we talk about as SDOH? And I'm sure you're all aware that right now SDOH is a buzzword at the federal level and elsewhere, but we were looking at different frameworks, different opportunities for making it easier to understand SDOH and make some differences there. So this is one framework that we like. It's called the Vital Conditions for Health and Well-Being, and it too has different conditions that we consider to be vital and need to be addressed to have a completely healthy outlook on your opportunities. And you can see one of those is the reliable transportation. So the next slide just calls out that one vital condition. And it's something that I know, Joe, when you invited me to speak, or actually it was Admiral Gerald to speak years ago, and I showed up, it was connecting with transportation that we had talked about it. We weren't doing it a whole lot or deliberately. But now it's it's kind of a no-brainer. You've got to talk about transportation in terms of the whole picture of building a healthy society. And this next slide, you can see these subcategories over on the right, the active transport, efficient energy, etc. So we started mapping. There's a group of people within the federal government across different agencies that have been meeting since the pandemic and started mapping the different subcategories to work that the agencies are doing. And it's really interesting if I don't know if it's not only in the federal government, but if you have your one silo or your lane, when you're actually asked to think carefully about it, well, how does your work relate to what's going on in transportation? It's surprising what you find. I think we can find something just about in everything we do. So this is early data. This is from March, and there's much more going on since then. Now, turning back to Healthy People 2030, there's many different topic areas within Healthy People, but I just pulled out a few to illustrate a connection with transportation and disease prevention, health promotion. So we have injury and violence objectives. These are a few of them that can be related to transportation, our vehicle crashes, safety belt use in car seats, drowsy driving, environmental health, looking at the air quality index, mass transit, physical activity, the walking or biking to get places, and then respiratory diseases, asthma, since asthma is so closely related to air quality. We have more objectives than just these here, but these are just a few I've pulled out. So this slide just looks at the objective on motor vehicle crash deaths. And if you can see the bottom of the slide, we actually have objective numbers and some information down there. So while we've made over the years, over the decades, we've tracked this one for a long time. One of the challenges with our initiative is that since it spans a long time, data sources change all the time, and it's hard to get comparable data across decades. So this is one that we've actually have consistent data for since 1999. And while we're making good headway here, we have we just set new targets for 2030, which you can see there. We have to get to some more reductions here, but there's always room to go. We do sometimes meet our targets. We don't change our targets if we meet them. We just keep working to do a better job. And this slide here is just an example of how we use the population level data to look at disparities. This is one from that same objective. While we have made strides and reductions, if you look at the population level data, you can see there are population groups that are not doing well at all. So while someone looking just at the national level data might say, hey, you're making reductions, you really need to drill down and look at this population level data to know where you need to focus your resources to make a difference. And again, this is something that COVID has really pointed out, the importance of looking at that population data. You know, where are the communities, the pockets, where populations are vulnerable and do not have very good health outcomes. So this next slide is just one of our environmental health objectives that tracks trips to work by mass transit. Again, it'll be interesting to see what happens because this objective was developed before the pandemic. People might be adverse to taking public transportation. I mean, if they're afraid of disease. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this data. We have had some discussion about, you know, do we need to start changing targets because we're in a completely different environment, but we haven't decided to do that yet. If nothing else, we keep our targets, and it's just a lesson into the huge impact that the pandemic has had on us. And this is another objective that has been around for a long time in our environmental health topic area, just looking at the air quality. Again, this is a leading health indicator. It's an objective that we work with EPA on, and its measurement, to me, is very complicated. The weighted days of air quality index. We have come up with different ways to try to simplify that into just one number, but it's not possible to do according to our EPA experts. But anyway, it's an important one to track, and it's one that no one would ever think about dropping when there were discussions about which objectives do we cut and which objectives do we cut from the leading health indicators. And then this is our asthma objective, which actually falls in the respiratory diseases topic area. This just is a snapshot of what you would see if you go to our website. That right now we just have the baseline data for this particular objective. I don't have the trend analysis because we changed the data source a little bit. So we weren't really able to trend that the way we wanted to. But once we do have additional data, you'll be able to click on the data links and find additional data and do some mapping. Now I'm going to turn over to physical activity, which is actually kind of a fun area for us to work in. It's kind of nice to have something to work on where you can actually do something that you like and it's making you healthy. So in our office, we do all sorts of things now when we were allowed to go to the office, like walking meetings. We have a dedicated time we give folks for physical activity. And we can justify all that, giving staff time for physical activity, because we developed the guidelines for the nation. So we say we have to walk the walk, and we do that. So this slide just simply demonstrates the importance of looking at physical activity and its impact of health, the billions of dollars that people who are inactive having inadequate physical activity costs the country. And also the premature mortality for people who are sedentary. That just really drives home the medical reason for us to be physically active. And this is just a snapshot from the 2020 objective we had for physical activity in older adults, those who were meeting the national guidelines. We actually met that objective. We have reset a new target, though, for 2030. So you can see our target was not necessarily high enough. We shy away from striving for 100% of anything, but there's always more work to be done. Then within physical activity guidelines efforts, we also look at cross-sector engagement, and we specifically have call out as the transportation, land use, and community design sector, recognizing that transportation and city planners, they need to build the sidewalks where people can walk, build the roads where people can ride their bikes. Land use, we need the parks and recreation space, and that ties into community design. If we have walkable communities, and now I think I owe you $1, Larry, for using your term. And I'm going to go back to the office and tell everyone I met you. So they might be calling you. But anyway, it's so interesting how all of this is connected. Things that people may take for granted, as simple as being physically active, they can have such a tremendous impact on improving your health and reducing chronic diseases. And this is now one of the objectives we have in the physical activity topic area. On physical activity, these are different, new for 2030. We had different ones for 2020, but in the effort to reduce the number of objectives, we came up with the two that we have. This one is actually for adults who walk or bike to get places, and the second one is for adolescents who walk or bike to get places. And that is it. That ends my remarks. But anyway, this has been exciting and fun to link something that I do at the policy level to all these practical applications. And it's interesting to know that we're all experiencing the same thing with respect to COVID and looking toward the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carter, for that excellent presentation. You're right, it ties in beautifully with the other two speakers. And in terms of questions, I think we want to just throw a couple at you before we open it up to a little bit broader discussion. The first one, you mentioned well-being. And on the transportation side, we always talk about quality of life, and we try to define that and quantify that. It's very difficult. Tell us a little bit more about well-being and how you handle that and how you quantify it.
Well, with the well-being, this is the first time we will have had a measure in healthy people to look at well-being, and we're using a life satisfaction question that, as I mentioned, will be added to the National Health Interview Survey. They've done the testing on it, so it's ready to go. There's some tweaks that they might want to do. We looked at different ways to ask that question. There are different surveys that are out that people have been using. For example, Gallup has data that's very accessible if you pay for it. And at the federal level, that's one of our limitations. Any data that we use for healthy people has got to be publicly available. And while we could buy a license for proprietary data, we'd have to continue to do that, and there could be some strings attached. So well-being is, as you said, just recognizing that to have a high-quality, healthy life, you have to have a sense of well-being. We had in past decades a whole topic area looking at health-related quality of life and well-being, but there had been differences within the field about how related those are to health. I mean, I think people have changed. They've moved along toward recognizing the importance of measuring something like well-being. that isn't necessarily connected to what we think of as physical health. What's your mental health well-being? If you're suffering financially, that affects your well-being. So it's new for us. We're really excited about it, since it is part of what I called those overall measures of health and well-being. It doesn't have a target because it is so global, and also it's a new measure that we're using, a new question in HIS. But we hope to be able to do more with that in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks for the clarification. Let's pivot now to a little bit more general discussion and maybe involving all the panel members. Larry, maybe starting with you. The topic that came to my mind while you guys were talking is this whole issue of scale, regional versus micro versus community, etc. And I think it's relevant to all the presentations. So I'd like to get maybe first, Larry, you to speak to that and how important it is to also look at the micro scale in terms of what we're doing.
Thank you, Joe. So the research I presented was what we call mostly on macro level walkability, but those are, we actually measure, and the granularity at which you're able to measure, like the Comox corridor I showed in downtown Vancouver, where you've got, really small area influences. The impact of the built environment on health is experienced at a very small scale. What's 2 blocks versus 4 blocks away, obviously from an air pollution exposure perspective, when it comes to particulates, I'm sure Alberto will have plenty to talk about on that, but the spatial scale is critical, and it will determine whether or not you detect health impacts that exist or not. We really have suffered historically by large geographies being averaged when it comes to the built environment, whole counties being averaged, for example. It's an artifact of the kind of data when you want to, for example, correlate COVID incidents with walkability. We didn't know and we're just now getting released in certain places, the addresses where people are, or anything about a locator. In public health, the information is so confidential. We're always struggling to, as planners, to get information down to an address or a block group, something where you're really getting a better reading on the experience. When someone walks out the door of their house, how good is the air they're breathing? How far is it to a store? And what's the characteristic of the pedestrian environment to get there? Those things are very tangible, and for more sensitive populations like elderly, anybody who's disabled or youth, it's even more critical. So the micro scale, meaning like, a couple hundred feet, we showed 300 meters, that's where I think the reason we saw the results we did on the intervention that we measured, that greenway, was because we had enough people in a very small area to be able to detect the impact that it had. So, a lot of the research that's been happening that, we've been part of, and others as well, is like, how do you buffer a location, or what's the area of influence, and how do you measure that using GIS, Geographic Information System software? So I look forward to hearing the response of Carter and Alberto.
Yeah, Alberto, I want to turn it over to you with a scale question, but I want to add to that this whole notion of equity as well, if you don't mind. Since I think Larry did a great job explaining a lot, but I want you to take that further, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, Joe. And as Larry was speaking, I was reflecting the issue of the scale, and specifically understanding pollution burdens and exposures at the micro scale, really is the next frontier of air quality management. I mean, when you hear our new federal government put an emphasis on environmental justice, it's all about what is happening at the local, at the fence level, right? At the fence line. I know that yesterday the conference had a session on environmental justice, and you heard about our community air protection program, our AB 617 program here in California. It is all predicated on understanding at the very, hyper-local level what are the disproportionate impacts from a pollution burden standpoint. So I think, to your point, I think that's the frontier. That's where we go from here, because some will argue that, and I show the map, we are marching and making progress on regional air pollution. But if you are the low-income resident who lives right next to a refinery or some other source, and your exposure is several times what the rest of the region is seeing, who cares if regional air pollution is getting better, right? So, like I said, given the fact that we have a new federal government that has prioritized environmental justice, because it's all tied to equity and social advancement and all of that, I think that's where we go from here. And you can tie it in terms of not only the type of research that Larry is doing to understand this hyperlocal scale, but also it's all tied to the new technology and low-cost sensors that are popping up everywhere. And again, it's the new frontier. I think 5 years from now, we're still going to be talking about this and the lessons that we learn to more strategically and surgically implement policies that will improve the local condition at the hyper level. And hopefully folks like Carter will be able to tie it into an improvement overall in terms of health.
Yeah, and speaking of Carter, take that conversation further if you don't mind.
Right. Well, our challenge with scalability and local data is that it's very tough to get the local data because of small numbers. I mean, we established these benchmarks at the national level using federal data sources. We work really closely with states and localities so they can use what we've done to model their own programs that would provide similar measures that they could benchmark against us. But the problem is at the local level, it's hard. We don't have that data. The numbers are too small, and that gets to the confidentiality. That's something that we're working on. It's when the way we're working with statistics, we have very, very rigid criteria that we work with. But there is a lot of exploration looking at different data sources, maybe stretching our comfort level with the type of data we're using, the data sources we're using. We have, sometimes we have problems with even YRBS, BRFSS, since they're state level, and they're not necessarily comparable across all states, depending on how states will ask questions. So it's a huge challenge. And as Alberto said, you could have people who say, oh gosh, the air quality is so good now. But if you have someone who's not in that good place, living next to a factory, they're not going to understand what you're talking about. So it's always a challenge. That's the importance of looking at data by population group and then locality as well, rural versus urban. There's all sorts of ways to slice and dice the data that you really need to do in order to come up with policies that will help everyone. But again, it's a challenge getting those small numbers for us.
Indeed. No, thank you for those remarks. We've got about 6 minutes or so left. I was wondering maybe we should have each panelist just make some closing remarks in terms of what you're thinking and what you heard, what you want to leave the audience with. So let's start with you, Larry.
Thank you. Well, foremost, this has been a really a good session, and I've enjoyed hearing from Alberto and Carter what you're doing, and I think understanding how the policy development process works, Carter. That was really helpful, and Alberto, how you're making decisions. I know that there's a real opportunity to better integrate one way to put it, the air pollution, the exposure science with the behavioral piece. So I talked about a lot of the research that I come from is more predicting physical activity and then chronic disease through that path, behaviors. And the exposure pathway obviously is just as important, and bringing those two until we effectively really merge the behavioral and exposure pathways, which is the purpose of kind of a paper I wrote with a diagram I showed. That was the purpose, is to really, we are able to do it. We control for air pollution exposure to isolate the effect of the built environment on physical activity and chronic disease. And conversely, sometimes we'll control for walkability to understand how air pollution exposure affects, health outcomes and chronic disease. But I don't think we've really effectively looked at the interaction between the two, and time and space. And this micro scale question is really where that will be necessary. So how interventions affect both air, and we got questions along those lines. But the exposure piece and the behavioral piece, I don't think are fully integrated yet. So I just wanted to mention that. And also on the equity side, the ability to miss the equity impacts or inequitable impacts of transportation investment decisions is very easy. Actually, it is essential. We will continue to miss how investments impact communities until we have the granularity and the micro level information that we need. So we are, in effect, this is a debate that has been going on for a while. The software tool that we built is off of parcel data whenever possible, because we know that the impacts are so locally born of the environment on health. And so unless we use micro scale tools like that, or other tools that are able to detect the behavioral and exposure-based relationships that exist in place and through time, and having that residential history information on people, I think is very important. So I think we're getting there, better and better. The data is improving. I think the discussion around transit and resistance to transit and how that will play out is going to be one of the most important things that we see going forward. I personally believe that people will change their behavior once they're vaccinated, and enough people are vaccinated. We're already seeing that in California. One thing we know about humans is that we adapt quickly, and especially to a direction that we're most comfortable with, former behavior. Reassuming former behavior is something we're probably, I don't suspect that we're going to long-term see a huge the resistance to transit is going to continue to be the driving made. As long as we make driving easy enough, we'll always have a difficult time getting people out of their cars. That's not going to change, but the kinds of strategies that Alberto is looking at, and Carter as well, and others are working towards can be quite effective. And I think the monitoring, having longitudinal data to track how local governments are doing, that we start to track land use decisions being made at the local level and use that as a basis to reward transportation investment dollars with. When we start doing that, when we start getting into performance-based funding and really provide incentives to implement the policies and decisions on the transportation and land use side that we need to see to change the behaviors to get the health benefits that we need and reduce GHG emissions, and spatially invest in lower income communities like the San Joaquin Council of Governments did, using the National Public Health Assessment Model. There's a published paper we just had out fairly recently. Those kinds of decisions, I think we'll start to see the changes we hope to see. So thank you for this opportunity to be part of the panel. Look forward to hearing from others.
Thank you. We've got about a minute, Alberto and Carter. Alberto, will you want to go next and give us some closing thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I'll keep it real quick, and I'm going to go higher level, maybe more philosophical. I do think that what we have seen in terms of race and equity, all those issues, and the pandemic has given our generation our fork in the road. But I mean, if I just take what I have heard in your conference, and congratulations to you and Matt Barth at UCR for putting this together, I do remain optimistic that even if we pick the road less travel, as the saying goes, I do remain optimistic that we are going to end up at a better place because of the fact that we recognize that we can do this. We can come back to normal. That is a normal that is better than it used to be.
Thank you, Alberto. Carter.
And just really quickly, I'll simply say that for me, it's been wonderful to hear Larry and Alberto talk about what they're doing more locally. At the federal level, we put out policies, and you don't always know how useful they are and what the uptake is. So it's gratifying to know that we're all thinking about the same thing. And I was glad one of you called some of the opportunities that COVID has brought as silver lining. I sometimes feel I don't like to say that because the pandemic was so horrible to think that there was a silver lining, but there definitely has been that will affect transportation policy and health.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, Larry, Carter, and Alberto, for excellent presentations. Very good discussion. Looks like next time we have the event, we'll have more time to go even deeper. So let's go join the closing session. It's going to be fairly brief, but I think it's good that we all go there and say goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.